Right, back to what I was saying. 800 years of history in 35 minutes now. we'll speed along. Little bit of an introduction. As you might expect, covering a lot of this period where there weren't any photographs. So it does have a lot of on-screen text, but I hope you will manage to reach the end without nodding off, such as the character on the screen at the moment. 800 years, what to leave out? That was the difficulty. There's quite a lot of information which I couldn't include, and I know there are people in this room this evening who will know quite a lot more about the Rectory and particularly its recent history than I do, so please bear with me. But I will try and highlight all the main changes, running through pretty much from 1200, the interesting sequence of occupiers and owners, and I ought to acknowledge where I've got a lot of the information from. Particularly helpful was the Dean and Chapter of Winchester Archive, which contains well over 300 documents relating to the Rectory. And their archivist, David Reimer, was very helpful at the beginning of COVID. He gave me a lot of information because obviously I wasn't able to go and physically visit the archive. And indeed, I've chosen not to go since because what he gave me was more than enough to kick off. There's lots of other common sources of information there. Some of you may recognise National Census, British Newspaper Archive, which is a really wonderful archive with over 50 million pages of newspaper information. And we get a lot of information about Albourne from that. And some local sources, including John Diamond, Albourne Tree Lines, which is transcription of all the births, marriages and deaths in the village from 1637 right up to 1925. If you've never looked at it, absolutely fascinating. And as late as last week, I stumbled across a little pamphlet in the Heritage Centre on the shelf I'd never noticed before. Architects and building craftsmen with work in Wiltshire. Exciting evening reading if you want it. And that added another little gem of information, which was quite useful. Firstly, a few definitions. Rector, come from the Latin, as so many of our words do, very much a ruler or a controller. It could be an individual or a corporate body and to whom the rectorial duties and income have been delegated. With that funny word, impropriation, in return for a rent. So it's originally more of an administrative role, leaving the vicar to deal with the religious duties. And of course the vicar, very much, the word means a substitute. But a rectory is a province or residence of a rector, and it doesn't just refer to a building, of course. It can include land, glebe lands, i.e. lands attached to a parish church, and or some of the tithes. These were the income or payments of tenth of produce of stock or money in lieu thereof from the land owned by the church. So the rector usually got the lion's share, but then he had to pay rent for the rectory to be in charge. And the small tithes went to the vicar. And the rectory house, just to confuse things even more, was often referred to as a parsonage, but pretty much one and the same thing. Whereas a manor, tract of land, estate or village, which the lord of the manor owned or controlled, was not normally owned or controlled by the church. So we have a bit of a distinction there. Doesn't always work, but broadly speaking, that should work. So it sets the scene. Hope you all follow that. I'm not going to ask questions at the end. You have that privilege. I won't. Right, prior to about 1200 AD, that's after the Normans had invaded, very much all the land and property in this country was pretty much controlled from France. And the Count of Perche in northern France delegated or impropriated the Church of Albourne to the local priory, also then still in France. But by 1289, the rectory had been granted to a priory in this country, so we begin to get more of an established ownership, for want of a better word, or certainly control. And it remained under their control until the dissolution of the monastery. So we've skipped on about 300 years in a few minutes. That all helps. But good old Henry VIII, as usual, when he upset things and divorced, so to speak, from the church in Rome, the control of the rectory passed to the crown, but I didn't mean the pub, of course I meant the crown as in regal crown. And a new structure was set up, the Dean and Chapter of Winchester. I may briefly refer to it as D&C later on, just to say a few words. And Henry VIII granted many manors and rectories to be administered by the D&C, so Albourne wasn't the only one, but there were others. And the Dean and Chapter could choose to farm the glebe lands much themselves, but usually they were leased or farmed out. We still use that phrase, don't we, farming something out, but it has its origins back in those times to a tenant or a rector. It might be a local landowner who could benefit from the income, but they had to pay the rent. So you have to sort of weigh out whether it was all really worth the bother of running the lands, but it probably was. And the lease that they would have was usually in multiples of 7 years, often for 3 lives worth, about 21 years. People didn't live quite as long in those days. But they either went to the grantee and perhaps 2 of the family. It didn't always work that way, but that was one of the general conditions. And the rector would also have to provide accommodation if there were any visitors from the church, from the D&C, from the Dean and Chapter. So there must have been some kind of building at that time. But we don't really know what it was or where it was. It could have been on the site of the existing manor or rectory, but there must have been something there. So they probably had bed and breakfast in some ways, hence the photograph at the bottom. 1551, this is the first direct granting of the rectory to a person that I find, to Joan Stevens. She was a widow, but it was to be held in as ample a manner as Thomas Goddard previously held it. Now the Goddards were very strong in this area, particularly in the 1400s, and maybe into the 1500s, so it certainly suggests somebody else had a hand in the rectory at that stage, but certainly Joan Stevens, 1551. We begin to get a bit of a steady sequence now. 1561 it passed to Thomas Waldron. Waldron, another famous family in the village from times past, and not unexpectedly, as late as 1615, some 40, 50 years later, there was a Thomas Waldron. May not be the same one, because so often in those days they passed on Christian names, make it really confusing for people trying to follow family history, using the same name over and over again. But they still held the lease, and it was granted at that point for another 21 years. But then the dreaded English Civil War intervened, and under Cromwell's plans, of course, the Dean and Chapter was to be abolished, but somehow it seemed to survive until the restoration of the monarchy, 1660, when Charles II returned. So again, Dean and Chapter were important. 1671, Oliver Nicholas. Again, the Nicholas name appears quite frequently in the history of Albourne. They held the impropriate rectory of Albourne. But then there's a bit of a gap in the story, at least a gap in the record. I'm sure there wasn't a gap really, but it's just that the documentation doesn't seem to fill a gap. Until 1719, and there's a letter of attorney in September that year by Edward Witts to surrender the rectory of Albourne and his right to a copyhold estate, formally granted to his father, Edward Witts, fustian maker. I guess you've all heard about fustian, those who have been in the village for a while. That crops up. It's a famous material that was made in the village for a long time, was very desirable for a lot of riches to the village in the 150, 200 years it was made. Anyway, fustian maker of Witney, Oxford. So the Witts family, again a famous name, had a hand in the rectory, but it did rather look as if they were being forced to give up that change of tenancy. It's about that time, we're into the 1700s, that the Neat family appeared in Albourne. Now they weren't natives of Albourne in that sense, they came from Devizes way, but they certainly owned land in this area. But it's not clear that they necessarily leased the rectory rights as early as the 1720s, but they were certainly prominent in the village at that time. So there's a period, probably almost 80 years, but it's not really clear who actually held the lease. Obviously, the Witts appear to have given it up, but it may not necessarily have been taken on directly by somebody else. Which is unfortunate, because Victoria County History of Wiltshire and Historic England, now the prime keepers of the records of buildings, believe that the bulk of the rectory, as we see it today, the middle section of the rectory, was built about 1740. And that's pretty much based on the style of the rectory and the architecture. So it's a bit of a shot in the dark, and that date has been carried forward in various other little publications about Albourne, but it really doesn't seem to be based on any direct evidence. Then, of course, the village was seriously affected. The Great Fire in 1760 destroyed much of the centre of the village, or actually it was regarded as a town in those days, because it was very successful. But we've got no evidence, really, that the rectory areas, at least as we see it today, was affected. It's just possible that it was, and maybe a new building was required, or the rectory was somewhere else and was damaged. But we've got quite good records about the Great Fires, both 1760 and in a moment 1777, and there's no mention of a rectory as such being damaged. But maybe it was just a building in the list of many things. 1771, a licence to alienate Albourne parsonage, remember parsonage could be rectory, by transfer or selling it was made by B&C, being the chapter and others. Similarly, in 1776, there was a valuation going on. So something was happening around that time. It seems to suggest a significant change. 1777, the Second Great Fire. Again, no direct evidence from all the records of the Great Fire that the rectory was affected. Then we get on to the really important bit, 1783. The rectory was being held by William Shepherd. Now, William was a seriously rich man. He owned pretty much the whole manor of Albourne, some 4,000 or 5,000 acres. That's the entire parish. So perhaps he instigated the building of a new rectory. We don't know. It's speculation, my speculation. I listen to that. But then he died, and his executors sold the whole of his estate. And there was a newspaper advertisement from which this is an extract. The parsonage and manor of Albourne, containing about 5,000 acres, that's the whole parish, and a neat, convenient, newly built dwelling house or sporting lodge with coach house, stabling, suitable offices, good garden, and a large forecourt. Now that sounds a pretty good description of the rectory. Might not be, but there aren't many other houses that we have in the village that have that description that we don't know about. Like the courthouse, that existed prior to that anyway. It's certainly not Beech Knoll, that came much, much later, as we've heard in previous talks. So it does certainly a newly built dwelling house. So I wonder if that was the centre portion of the rectory as we see it today. Whatever, the leasehold of the rectory, once William Shepherd had died, went to Stephen Neat. Now I'll put a brackets 1 because again we have this repetition of the Christian name. We have another Stephen waiting in the wings. But this one went to Stephen Neat, who'd been in the village thereabouts for some years. But there's an undated document. Now when I saw this listed in the 300 or so documents down at Winchester, it lists several cottages in Mr. Neat's hand in the right parsonage, and includes the names of 4 tenants, which I've had a look at John's tree lines and cross-checked. They only really coexisted as adults around about 1789, 1790, so about that period. So again, it sort of narrows it down that something substantial happened. It came into Mr. Neat's hand. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a red herring to start with because it's catalogued down at Winchester as describing the house at Alborn in Mr. Neat's hands. But I obtained a copy of it and found that it isn't a copy to do with his house, it's about the houses he owns as part of the rectory. So it's a real bit of a red herring. 1815, the first Stephen Neat died, and his son, Stephen Neat, how original, born in 1773, took over the lease. So he was just, what, in his 40s about that, at that stage. And then he seemed to engage a leading architect, Charles Dyer from London, and he's famous for lots of buildings in Bristol. Any of you who may know Bristol. And he's credited with work being done at Alborn Parsonage in 1833. Now that seems a bit late, perhaps, for the whole building, perhaps to have been constructed at that stage. You've got a leading architect, so it's possible. But more likely, he added a bit on to the main part of the building that had been built by William Shepherd. And as we shall see later, the left-hand side of the building, as you see it at the moment, was definitely added at a different period to the main central portion. Stephen Neat II, very much a benefactor to the village, didn't shut himself away. There's even a newspaper article from January 1833, coincidentally, the time that maybe something was added to the additional building. This is a copy of the actual newspaper, so it's a little bit blurred. We understand that Stephen Neat, Esquire, according to his benevolent custom at this season, has distributed a large quantity of blankets and a plentiful supply of excellent soup to all the poor within reach of his hospitable mansion in Alborn parish. So we're pretty sure we're talking about the old rectory. The lease was renewed 1839, and 1845 Stephen II died, and the lease passed to his son, Francis Webb Neat. At least it was a change of Christian name, which helps a little bit. And it stayed in his hands until 1861, and then the Dean and Chapter released or relinquished control of the rectory and indeed other lands throughout the south of England to the ecclesiastical commissioners. That was a bit of a fire sale in a way, I think, because immediately they sold off the rectory to the sitting tenant, Francis Webb Neat. No doubt sold other properties as well. Obviously a big Victorian fundraising campaign at that stage. So the church is beginning to relinquish its hold on the rectory, be it the building and the lands, beginning to slip away. And then in 1869, Francis removed to Reading. That's an extract I took from an advert in the newspapers again to say he was moving. Sold off all his furniture, wonderful array of furniture. I didn't want to digress with that this time. But a fantastic advert. Anyway, he removed and he sold the rectory and the associated land to Henry James Puckridge. And he was a retired farmer. To give you some idea of the values, that was something around £150,000 at today's values. So a bit of a bargain, I would say. Very hard to judge values over those periods of time, but that was what it was sold for, £2,250, including some land. Now, he was quite a sociable chap, it appears, Henry, perhaps following on from from Stephen, who obviously opened up the premises and gave out food and clothes. He was quite a social chap. 1870, opened up the rectory grounds. Again, this is a copy of the original newspaper article, so I'll read a little bit of it. But the Ancient Order of Foresters at Ramsbury intend to hold a picnic in the park of Henry Puckridge at Alborn on the 25th. This was July, I think, yes, being feast time, so just around about this feast. And they were going to march from Ramsbury all the way to Alborn, headed by a brass band, and then into the park of the above-named gentleman who's kindly lent the use of it for the day. And they go on to talk about tickets and tea and all sorts of things. So it was obviously open to holding events in the grounds. Henry later bought Ford Farm. That's the farm, obviously, as you exit on the Hungerford Road. Many of you will be familiar with that. And he lived quite a long while in the rectory, right up until 1902. And although the property passed on, unsurprisingly, to his family, it was quickly sold on to Frederick Frampton, who was another farmer already established up at Upper Upham. Now he appears to have sold that for a very pittance almost, considering, but it does seem possible that because it didn't necessarily include all the land, it may have only been the building, the house itself, that might have compromised the value. But the 14 shillings and no pence does seem to be quite relevant, very exact. But Frederick Frampton didn't live there too long, because 5 years later he died, and it passed on to Mary Ann Langstave Daines, a widow from London. So people from outside the village area now appearing in the ownership. Just the £1,100 is getting cheaper as the time goes along. But again, it might hint that not all the land, all the original glebe lands were part of the deal, or they'd already been sold off separately. Very hard to follow that bit. 2 years later, Mary died. Yeah. If you're reading down the bottom, as I say, it must have get a bit of a bad reputation, but I suspect it was because these people had made their money, they were looking forward for retirement, and sadly were of an age, or maybe retirement didn't agree with them, as often seems to be the case. But anyway, she died, left the estate to her nephew, who immediately sold it on to Arthur White, a provisions merchant from London. But he died a year later, or even later that year, I should say. And the property stayed in the family. It passed to his sister, possibly daughter, because they had the same name, Hilda Mary White. And she at least seems to have hung on to the property as a trustee, possibly with one or two more tenants, because I found a newspaper report of a wedding there of the daughter of Brigadier General Pierce of the old rectory. That was in 1917. But anyway, by 1919, the property was definitely up for sale again. And that's a copy, reasonably clear on the screen there, of Albourne Glebe Lands for sale, the old rectory house, Albourne. And that was in March 1919. Lots of changes going on in the ownership of large houses at the end of the First World War. So that went with 362 acres. At least the price had gone up a little bit, or relatively speaking. And this passed to a chemical manufacturer, Reynold Percival Mallinson, all the way from Derbyshire. So whether or not he was moving south for his benefits of climate, or if he had business reasons down this way, it passed on to somebody else. And at last, we're into the era now when we can get some photographs. This is a photograph from around about 1920. We did have a date showing the house pretty much as you see it today, but you may notice it looks a little bit lopsided. There's a lot more house on the left, perhaps, of the front door than there is on the right-hand side. So not very pretty, and that probably points towards the extension that took place. It was a symmetrical based house in the 1700s when it was built. And then they added a bit in 1833, possibly, and it sort of swept the whole thing off. But generally speaking, looks very much as today. And this is a view not many people perhaps have seen from 1920 at the rear of the rectory. Quite interesting in this case that, if I can get my mouse to work on this, we've got a long veranda at the back, very pleasant, some seats on, and obviously some flowers and that. Very typical, perhaps Edwardian style almost, of the rear of the property. And remember that, and these windows at the top here, this one curved window. Again, if I was a historical or architectural historian, I'll be able to date that precisely. That's understood as that. And the bit on that end of the building, which is the bit that was added on a bit later on. So this is, we're probably looking at the centre part of the original house around here. We'll come back to that picture a little later. And the building was still being used. Here we have a popular picture people have seen before of the All-Born Band outside posing after one of their successful competitions, judging by the cups and the badges outside. Interesting, the colour of the door changes a little bit over the years. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's white. Got a wonderful knocker showing on that one. You feel that sort of door needs a big heavy-duty knocker. Nowadays you have some modern thing. But anyway, 1923, Mallinson sold the property on to spinster sisters Evelyn and Adeline Fox of Hammersmith for £3,200. That's Evelyn, the picture you may recognise. Warwick Hood did a wonderful pen portrait of Evelyn and the sister in the Dabchick a little while ago under the series of Who Lived in a House Like This, and in this case we're talking about the Rectory. Evelyn Fox applied for permission to build a wing on the property. That actually turned out to be the right-hand side as we see the house today. And we can actually have a little look at that because that's a picture just after 1923. Showing now the extension on the right-hand side, looking a little fresher, lacking some of the greenery. Doesn't seem to be any greenery on here, whereas the whole of the front of this property is covered in either Virginia creeper or ivy or something like that. But this bit, the roof looks newer and the brickwork isn't covered in greenery. So that's obviously a later addition. And this is a bit of an aerial shot from 1929. I'm going to show it on the screen, only for the benefits of the people at home on their Zoom, but there's a much better copy standing on the tables over at the front there you can have a look at when we have a tea break later on. And again, you can see just about, there's the Rectory, there's the new extension on the end with the roof still showing quite freshly white. Can't see so well in here, but lacking the ivory. An interesting early aerial photograph of the village, of course, 1929. For example, right down here, this is the area of where the horse Hightown racing stables were. The buildings that are now the co-op, and along here, round past the forge, and down South Street. And also the original farm that was along this area, the Glebe farm, and of course lacking Glebe Close and all the buildings down at the bottom end of the village, isolated old buildings that were subsequently demolished, and this is Farm Lane running right up here. And so all that area, and of course the gardens of the Rectory were extensive. They ran right from here, right up to that boundary there, and right up towards the Bucks in this corner. And of course, originally, they'd owned all the land right down to Farm Lane as well, and beyond, indeed, down to Fort Farm, which you can still see the garden area here, but 1929. I've zoomed in a bit, again, probably doesn't show up too well, but this is the newer extension on the right-hand end that the Fox sisters had. They remained at the Rectory for many years. As you may know, Evelyn was pioneer in the field of mental health welfare, and later appointed CBE, and later became a Dame in 1947 for all early work. Her organisation went on to become Mind, the mental health organisation that still exists today. But despite that she was very busy professionally, she was involved in lots of village organisation. Her name crops up in lots of things to do with the WI and the Hall and all sorts of things, and she often opened up the grounds for the village social events. And they bought extra land, so instead of selling off as some of the previous owners of the Rectory land, she was actually buying land right down to Farm Lane and up to the Bucks, and quite extensive. And they must have been quite worried, and I mentioned it in the previous talk, when Wilts Council were going to realign the main Swindon-Hungerford Road through the village in 1939 to take out a bit of a kink by the post office, and it would have run right through the Rectory front lawns on its way down to Farm Lane. But they suggested this in August 1939. Unfortunately, fortunately perhaps, war broke out a month later and it was all forgotten about. And then we still got that funny kink. Although the road was widened slightly, you still got a little bit of a kink just outside the post office area. The foxes were disturbed in 1940 because obviously at that time many great houses were requisitioned by the War Department, and parts of the main house were then put aside for service personnel, and that obligation remained right through to 1944. And as we know, some of the American paratroopers were based in the building. We had another band of brothers tour this afternoon. There was one yesterday, another one today. Very popular spot. And the band of brothers tours as they head off towards Europe to start off in Auburn. And so there were people staring through the gates of the Rectory again this afternoon for a while. And then late in 1944, the Foxes, for one reason or another, sold the Rectory and the grounds to Thomas and Ruth Lewinsky for about £6,000, about a $250,000-ish or so at today's values. Still a bit of a bargain, I think. Thomas died quite soon afterwards, but the property, yes, yet again, the property passed to Ruth, but then bear in mind the Foxes had been there for well over 20 odd years, so there were longer periods. The property passed on to Ruth. She was a cookery writer and a bit of a socialite, and they entertained extensively. And then she seems to sell it, it's a bit blurred, I'm not quite sure about this, to a partnership. She was still involved. But then by 1952 it changed hands, and Henry Nyberg, an antique dealer, appears on the scene, and he was destined to live there for nearly 20 years. So again, a longish period for people. That's a picture of Henry. He's the one on the left, and he was well into alternative religion, and he was very much a case of a devotee of transcendental meditation. Now I can see you all with your beads and your flowers in your hair over there. You're of an age to remember that. And as the Maharishi Yogi and the Beatles were very great followers of that practice for a while in the 60s. And there's Henry with the Maharishi in 1962. I'm going to refer back to that a little bit later on. Now, things start to change rapidly, and this is where some of you in the room may know better than I, but certainly in the 70s, Henry sold on to David Jackson, who briefly trained racehorses from the Rectory. 1980s, property changed again. Early in the 80s, it was sold to a family called Eardley Wilmot. I can't find out very much about those, but maybe people remember them. We'll hear that perhaps a bit later on. You can chip in and correct me. But then it changed again. It moved on and sold to John Titcombe, a builder and developer. But of course, he mainly sold off the land to Hannix, who built the houses in Turnpike and Rectory Wood. And certainly some of you will remember that well, I should think. That must have been quite a dramatic change in the profile of the village in the centre to have these new houses built. John became bankrupt, left Auburn, and the house was occupied by a well-known face for those of you of an age. Some of you younger ones over there, Ian, Edwina, probably don't know Max Robertson, but he was a very well-known commentator on television, and he just divorced from his wife, and he occupied the house. It's not actually clear whether he actually owned it, or it was owned by his friend, Patricia Saville, who was an artist. And she had a self-contained studio added onto the property. But whatever, they only stayed for a very short time. They soon moved on to live in the Channel Islands by 1986. And that's when the house was up for sale. And we've actually got here a copy of the sales prospectus, 1987, for the old Rectory, Auburn. Looking very nice on a nice summer's morning. Need to get up early to take the photograph to get the best of the house before the sun goes round to the south, but that's a good shot. This time it was bought by people, John Jarvis, who many of you will know, still living in the village, but no longer actually in the Rectory, of course, who was then a hotelier. John and his family lived there right through to about 2015. It's funny, I had more trouble pinning down the dates for the more recent years than I did some of the things 200 years ago. But about 2015, John sold the property on. And the new and current owners, I'm pleased to say, are with us this evening. James and Fiona. Spencer Jones bought the house and undertook some extensive renovations to the main house, which took a few years and maybe still ongoing, I think you would agree, James. So although we see the front elevation much as it's been, but now the greenery is gone long last. Much fresher looking building. Still the Fox's extension on the right and maybe the Neat's extension on the left. But essentially the whole house is now nicely balanced and looking very smart in the last week or two when I took that photo. However, the rear of the rectory, we jump back to the picture you saw earlier on in 1920, remember that, has changed quite considerably. Now, I said, remember that window, that's the window we're looking at in the 1920 picture. Now, of course, the Foxes added this bit on this side, and of course they sort of carried on that similarity of that same window. So all this extension here, but James and Fiona have added on this long building, not building, that would be unfair, a series of rooms at the back to replace what was the conservatory. In fact, John Jarvis, I believe, had put the conservatory on. It used to be a veranda, then it became a conservatory. Now it's a much more pleasant building. I've called them sunrooms. I don't know what James, have you got a name for them? Is sunrooms okay? But there's lots of sun come in, yes. Still obviously following on the previous style, but obviously much more suitable for a family living accommodation. And as James mentioned to me a week or two ago, it's surprising. The building is very broad, but it's very shallow. Originally, it only really was one room deep. They were reasonably good rooms in the original building and in Victorian times. They were a good room, but really only one deep. And this recent change has added a little bit of depth to the building, making a much more friendly family home. But they still tried to retain a lot of the original window arrangements. So they're sort of within there. You can't see them now on the outside, they're still on the inside. And then remove much of the render. I'll come on to that one. And this now reveals the old central part of the building as it was in the 1780s, let's say, when it was originally erected. And this is and obviously with today's rules and regulations, it had to be built in similar brick, similar style, to carry on many features. But you can sometimes see the join. I hasten to add, this is not a modern join. The section on the left-hand side of the screen was probably the one that went up in the 1830s. That was probably the early, well, just slightly pre-Victorian, by the Dyer architect. And the one on the right is the original brickwork from the 1780s. And they didn't make a very good attempt at joining the two together. It's still very obviously a different part of the building. This is an unusual view of the house. And you may tell, oops, sorry, I do apologise. You may tell from the PowerPoints just below the table, it's actually a model. It's a doll's house version of the main house. We see it today, and that's still sitting in a prominent place in James and Fiona's living area. And I think that came from John Jarvis, we believe. So he left that as part of the legacy. They get two houses for the price of one. You deserve it, I think. So that's rather nice. So there we have it. Brief summary of property which have origins. Well, it's a bit more before you go, Liz. Sorry. You didn't think I was going to just finish like that, did you? A brief summary of a property origins 800 years ago. Many changes and new custodians, because I think these properties very much, as indeed all our houses, we're just custodians. We're just moving on. The houses outlive us all. 600 years closely associated with the church, runs right through to the Demon chapter of Winchester. And then that religious link sort of broken off after that period. And we've lost the lands associated with the original concept of a rectory, but the building remains a significant reminder of its former role. But wait. Oh, that should say there are at least 2 elephants in the room. Present company accepted, of course. That's a management speak for 2 things which are quite important, but which haven't been mentioned so far. William and Robert Wells and the Rectory. Now, I haven't mentioned the Wells, the family who were famous for making bells in the village for well over 150, maybe 200 years. And it's been suggested to me that both William and Robert occupied or even owned the Rectory. That would presumably, from the dates that they were alive, from the mid-1700s or through to the 1800s, early 1800s. And indeed, he wrote a will William wrote his will in 1754, then chose not to die for another 17 years, and apparently assigned the Rectory to his son Robert. But the Rectory was still owned by the Dean and Chapter of Winchester in the 1700s, so maybe it was the lease that he assigned. I don't know, but interestingly, there's absolutely no reference to the Wells family in the Rectory papers down at Winchester. So I personally haven't resolved that apparent conflict of ownership. I think it was William Shepherd and then the Neats, that it was possible that somehow the Wells people in that period, up until about 1780, when it wasn't quite clear who owned the lease or had the Rectory, it's possible. But surprisingly, no mention that I can see in the archives. Albeit that the archives that I've seen are only the headings or the summaries. I haven't seen the physical documents, but I'm sure names are usually mentioned in the catalogue if there are any there. Nothing about the Wells family. And had Robert had any direct connection with the Rectory, you might expect to find it in the bankruptcy papers, 1925. There is a mention about the Rectory, but that's because Stephen Neat, living in the Rectory, bought many of Robert's redundant properties because he was bankrupt in and around the square. But I'm quite open to any suggestions. That's further investigation to look at. And the other big question, is it a rectory or a manor? Is there ever any evidence that the property was ever a manor? As I mentioned earlier, 300 documents down in Hampshire relating to the Rectory. I haven't seen them firsthand, but David Rymel, who was very helpful, did mention to me that only occasionally the word manor does occur. 1726, the manorial court papers referring to the transfer of the Rectory or Rectory Manor granted to the Dean and Chapter of Winchester in 1541. So in 1541, it was referred to alternatively as a Rectory Manor. In the same papers, it refers to the deputation to hold a court for the manor of Rectory of Althorn, and elsewhere to the Dean and Chapter's manor of Rectory of Althorn. So the 2 words are then joined together in the same context. Well, David said, referring to that there are references to a manorial court, and in a sense the Rectory was a manor in its own right, distinct from the main Althorn manor. So he recognised, because I told him about the recent change, that he said when it had changed, it had some justification, although it might be said that it's an old manor, but not the old manor. I'm not sure that that would look so well on the gate, in a way, an old manor, but that's one way of getting around it, perhaps. So when did the name change in that sense? Well, when the house was put up for sale by Max Robinson or Patricia in 1987, as I said, it was advertised then as the Old Rectory. But talking to John Jarvis, he definitely bought it as the Old Manor. The name was already in use. So perhaps the name change had never actually been formally registered on legal documents, and the estate agents were duty bound to advertise it and in the legal sense as the old rectory. So who might have changed the name? The rectory has a religious connotation, so might it would be someone who felt uncomfortable with that link, possibility. Henry Nyberg. He became very involved in the 1960s, I said, transcendental meditation, etc. But is there any evidence that he changed the name as long ago as that? There is. In 1966, Henry, being in the antiques trade, sold off a collection of knives and forks and spoons, the property of Henry Nyberg, the Old Manor, Aldbourne. So even as early as 1966, the date, the name had changed, at least from Henry's point of view, from the publicity point of view, but maybe not legally in some ways. And so although there were changes of ownership right through the 70s and 80s, that name persisted even if it hadn't been changed. And I've looked online to Wilts Council, and there were planning applications well into the 80s, still referred to as the old rectory if they wanted to add something or change something. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the old manor became the usual name in Wilts planning applications. So other than knowing that it's at least since the 1960s, we're not really sure. So whatever it is, the old rectory, the old manor, still a fine building, with a long history, and obviously a lot more detail that could be examined by looking at some of these individual occupants and going first hand to the archive down in Wiltshire. Yes, you can go and make the tea and coffee now. But I just would like to acknowledge and thank Fiona and James Spencer-Jones for their cooperation during my recent research, for allowing me to take photographs of the external part of the house and to show the building as it is today as part of the history. And that's all, folks. That's the end. But I'm quite happy to take my questions.
May I thank Alan very much. I think on behalf of us all, we've done some meticulous research, as is his wont. Not to the bottom of everything I know. He and I have conversations about this.
Yes, the Wells family in particular.
But I can remember the old manor being named the old rectory on there in my younger days. What I was going to say though was, you touched on, we had groups of American tourists. We had a group today, and probably you'll see some gawping at your front gate, because we always take all the groups, we stop there, look into it, because in the war it was occupied by E Company and F Company of the 101. And headquarters. It's headquarters, yes, headquarters in the office. And it's a very important building in that respect. In any case, it's a very important building. I well remember Henry Nyberg. He was the vice president of our cricket club. He had a partner called Mr. Hoffner, and they were partners in more ways than one. And they were very generous to the village. They didn't do much, they were just financially generous. And in your conservatory, which is your sunrooms now, we would have the cricket club teas. And they were lovely. And they still would be if it was again. But I've got so many memories of it. But thank you very much, Alan. That's different stories altogether. The actual history of the rectory, the old manor, is going to be the old manor forever now anyway. And anyone who lives here now will know that that's what it is. It's only a few old diehards that think it was the old rectory. And yes, thank you very much, Skinner, and thank you so much for allowing us to do this. And we hope we keep together on it.